First of all, thank you all so much for coming here this afternoon. It's wonderful, but not surprising, to see so many of you. And I hope that you'll also all be able to join us in the Archive Centre afterwards for tea, coffee, drinks and cake, and also for a display in the Archive Centre reading rooms of some of Bill's papers and some of the papers relating to Bill. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Alan Packwood, and for today at least, I'm going to be the keeper of the Churchill Archive Centre, not the director. Because, of course, keeper is the title which Bill held and the title which he clearly loved. And I know this because after Archive Centre events, Roskill lectures, symposia, he would always send me the most wonderful thank you letters containing his effusive congratulations to the team. But they would always contain a PS, and that PS always lamented the change of title and urged me to change it back to keeper. So, as this audience knows, he was a remarkable figure, once met, never forgotten, full of strong opinions, but equally full of friendship and humour. And the Churchill Archive Centre, as we're going to hear, is but one of his many legacies. We're going to hear in a moment from our guest speakers, but his was a life lived to the full, producing an incredible body of work, academic books alongside newspaper columns and TV programmes. But he was also a family man, and it's really we owe so much, and we owe this occasion to his two daughters, Claire and Hilary, and to his granddaughters who are here with us today. And that leads me to an important point, and one that I think Bill would have wanted me to make right at the outset, namely that his success came out of an enduring partnership with Ruth. Family members will be able to say far more than I about this, but I think Ruth was his rock, his biggest supporter, his closest advisor, and I suspect that if Bill were here, he would say that without her, none of what you're about to hear would have happened. So what did happen? Most of you are already familiar with the outline of Bill's career, but I thought it was important to set out the bare bones at the beginning to put what follows in context. So Correlli Barnett was born on Tuesday, the 28th of June, 1927. He was educated at Trinity School in Croydon and then at Exeter College, Oxford. He served in the Intelligence Corps before undertaking a master's and working for the North Thames Gas Board, a position which inspired his one novel, The Hump Organisation, which you can see up in our Archive Centre reading rooms later. Then, of course, the historian took over and the books really started flowing. The Desert Generals, the Sword Bearers, Britain and her army, the collapse of British power, Marlborough, Bonaparte, the Great War, the audit of war, engage the enemy more closely, the lost victory, the verdict of peace, and leadership in war. An incredible work rate, made more incredible when you realise that in the 1960s and 70s, he was helping to write several major historical documentary TV series, and that from 1977 to 1995, he was an extremely active director of the Churchill Archive Centre. And the Churchill Archive Centre certainly owes him an enormous debt. He created a wonderful team, and so pleased that so many of them are here today. He built up the collections. He persuaded a science college to grow its history. He fought the Archive Centre's corner ferociously when necessary, but he was also capable of flattering the great and good. And it's because of him that the Churchill Archive Centre secured the Churchill and the Thatcher papers. But enough from me. We've got a panel of people who worked with Bill in different ways. 4 of them you're going to hear from in person, and 2 are sending pre-recorded messages. We're going to start where Bill started, both in his personal life and in his writing, namely with the army. And I'm delighted that we can go to the very top, because we have with us here today General Lord Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, a man who had a very full career in the military, serving in Belfast and Bosnia and many other places, and rising, of course, to become the professional head of the British Army between 2006 and 2008. Richard wrote the foreword to Bill's last book, Leadership in War, in which he praised Bill's lifetime of scholarship. And we're grateful to him for agreeing to come and expand on those remarks today. General Lord Dannatt.
Well, Alan, thank you very much for your introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a huge privilege and honour to be invited to take part in this commemoration and celebration of Bill Barnett's life. A great privilege to be here this afternoon. Correlli Barnett, Bill, as those who knew, respected and loved him called him, as we've heard, was born on the 28th of June 1927 and died on the 10th of July 2022. Those are the bare facts, the bookends, if you like, of a remarkable life that we've all gathered together this afternoon to celebrate. And of course, we'll all have our own memories of a father, a grandfather, a brilliant historian, friend or colleague, or so much more that we treasure. And many of those memories will be shared this afternoon. For myself, I read and respected Bill's historical writings and analysis long before I first met him. As a schoolboy in the 60s and a young officer in the 70s, the received wisdom was that the soldiers of the Great War were lions led by donkeys, and that battlefield success in the Second World War was predominantly down to the brilliance of Bernard Montgomery. However, the joy for me was that Bill and Ruth only lived a couple of miles from me in Norfolk. Visits to Catfield House, or Fort Catfield, were always moments of fun, challenge, and enjoyment. You could never spend time with Bill without experiencing that sense of the imp within him as he expressed his own views with a sure-footed confidence that challenged those accepted narratives. I was about to say that accepted wisdom, but I think I'll leave it as accepted narratives, narratives that Bill was inclined to debunk without undue ceremony, but only after careful research, thought, and analysis. It was therefore with some trepidation that I asked to meet him about 10 years ago to discuss a follow-on to his acclaimed book, Britain and Her Army, when I was tempted to write Boots on the Ground, Britain and Her Army since 1945. In the conversation which followed, it became clear that we were very much on the same wavelength, or perhaps I'd tuned into his with our... Always helps if you keep your notes in the right order, doesn't it? With our shared analysis of the opportunities squandered by the United Kingdom after the Second World War, the welfare state contending with the warfare state, as traditional views and imperial ties held back the potential of industrial and economic transformation. Well, this is not the moment to reopen an academic debate, as tempting as that might be, and one with which I'm sure Bill would have enjoyed participating in, if not leading. But perhaps we can come to that later over a glass of something. It was, however, a privilege for me, as you've just heard, when Bill asked me to write the foreword for what became his last major book, The Lords of War, Supreme Leadership from Lincoln to Churchill, a book that might usefully be studied by those aspiring to supreme leadership in our country at the present moment. However, when reading the manuscript 10 years ago, I was gripped by his introductory essay on the nature of leadership. At the time, I thought the brilliance of the book was signposted in Bill's introductory essay on the nature of leadership. In the final paragraph of his introduction, Bill concluded that the secret of leadership lies not in managing human resources, but in cherishing human relationships. In the chapters that followed, he tested his thesis in limited war, coalition war, and total war from the perspectives of military and civilian leaders alike. And in the 20 chapters that comprise that book, one famous or infamous career after another was distilled with great clarity and skill into a refreshingly focused conclusion that left the reader in no doubt about the particular trait of character that Bill had highlighted to pursue in his argument. From Napoleon Bonaparte's realization that to succeed he had to feed his army with success, almost regardless of the strategic consequences, through Lincoln's struggle to find a general with whom he could do business, and on to Churchill's determination to achieve victory at all cost. This last book was a grand march through the 19th and 20th century experiences of war in all its energy and ferocity. Every chapter added strength to Bill's original thesis. Perhaps the apparent surprise at the end of that book was the absence of a concluding essay drawing the threads of the work together. The tidy mind has always sought a beginning, a middle, and end to any enterprise, but Bill dignified both himself and his readers by allowing the text to finish at the conclusion of those 20 studies. Although the study of Churchill's leadership to victory was very appropriately the final offering, the penultimate study of Adolf Hitler, spellbinder and fantasist, validated Bill's thesis most vividly. After the easy victories of 1940, the German people would have followed Hitler to hell and back. But when the gates of hell beckoned, the German people were abandoned by their leader. As Bill commented, for Hitler, the German people's existence was only justified by their usefulness as instruments of his personal ambition. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill, never in the field of human conflict had a people been so abused for so long by such a leader so determined to fulfill his own selfish wishes. And I think with judgments such as that, Bill quite properly refrained from a concluding essay, allowing the reader the privilege of drawing his or her own conclusions. And I believe that such an ending is a tribute to Bill's brilliance as an author and a historian. It was Correlli Barnett at his vintage best. And of course, it was not just in his formal published books that Bill expressed his views. Private conversations were always fun and stimulating. Indeed, he carried those private conversations, as it were, to many people's breakfast tables with his regular column in the Daily Mail, commenting on current affairs. He often said that people were rather snooty about the Mail, but he felt that he was speaking to Middle England through his column in that paper, and I believe he had a real point there. I'm sure he would be relishing the current goings-on in Downing Street, Whitehall, and Westminster today. Well, this afternoon, others will reflect on their appreciation of Bill. For me, I'm just most grateful to have known him as a friend, as a mentor, and as someone who could read the evidence, reach their own conclusions, state their own opinions, and do so without fear or favor. We need people with moral courage like Bill more than ever today. I salute his achievements, and I salute his memory. Thank you, Bill.
Right, it is now time to hear from Bill's fellow historians. And we're going to see on screen Sir Max Hastings, historian and broadcaster, followed by Professor Gary Sheffield, a leading expert on the history of the First World War and someone who has followed Bill in that he's now president of the Western Front Association. Both men met Bill early in their careers, and both have since engaged deeply with his work in a number of ways.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am among a whole generation of historians of war fortunate enough to have sat at the feet of Bill Barnett, both figuratively and almost literally, and to have been profoundly influenced by his writing in my own career. I devoured the Desert Generals as a sixth form schoolboy, and even then recognized the book's importance. In my gap year, I worked as a humble researcher on BBC TV's Great War series, for which Bill was among the most distinguished scriptwriters. Later, I boundlessly admired The Audit of War and other big books that he wrote. Those of you who are younger, perhaps a lot younger, may not understand first how profoundly nationalistic was the approach to recent history of most British writers and readers in the 1960s. This was still the immediate post-Empire as well as post-war period. My own father, who had been a well-known war correspondent, was nonetheless jingo enough to believe perfectly sincerely that Britain had played the dominant Allied role in World War II, with the Americans supplying the chewing gum and the Russians somewhere out in the eastern wilderness doing heaven knew what. Bill played a critical role in teaching us all to think differently, to realize how poor had been the performance of Britain's army and generals for much of the war, how much Field Marshal Montgomery's personal role had been overblown, how grievously historians had underrated the central role of economics and industry in both war and peace. What happened in the factories was every bit as important as what happened on battlefields. The defeat of Germany and Japan owed at least as much to their relative economic weakness as to Allied firepower and air power. It doesn't matter that today some of Bill's judgments are challenged or even discredited, and I myself dissent from a good many. What counts is that he taught us how to review objectively, and if necessary, harshly, previously accepted myths and legends. He wrote with fluency and clarity. He helped my generation to understand that we must approach the past not in a spirit of iconoclasm, but stripped of foolish nationalistic illusions. He was an eager controversialist, but never an irresponsible one. He was an inspiration to a young writer and also extraordinarily friendly and kind to me personally when I was the most junior of his colleagues at the BBC, where some of his scriptwriting peers conducted a reign of terror. He himself, in old age, was a little sad, I think, that the British academic world had treated him with less respect than his work deserved, and I believe that he was justified. The history of war is treated with an unworthy condescension by some specialists in other disciplines. It's deplorable that Bill was never appointed a Fellow of the British Academy. Academics, I'm afraid, are sometimes envious of authors who write more accessibly than themselves, who attract more widespread notice, and who sell far more books. Bill's career suffered from all this. Yet today, I know few students of conflict, and especially of the Second World War, who do not recognize a debt to Correlli Barnett and to his remarkable body of work over a lifetime, which makes it such a pleasure to pay tribute to him today. He was a lovely man who did remarkable things, and he formed a template that many others of us have unashamedly followed.
Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it really is a case of not physically being able to be in two places simultaneously. I was very fond of Bill and I admired him as a historian. I first met him when I was a young lecturer at Sandhurst, and he went out of his way to put me at my ease. And that's probably just as well, because I was quite in awe of him. And certainly I knew of his work, first reading his books when I was a teenager back in the 1970s. The first book of his I can remember is his trenchant critique of Napoleon, or Bonaparte, as he entitled his book. He didn't fall for any of that romantic Napoleonic nonsense. At the time, he certainly converted me to his viewpoint on Napoleon. I remember writing an undergraduate essay heavily based on that source. And I was amused in later years to find out how much that book had offended some die-hard Napoleon fans. Well, that book had Bill's trademark mixture of erudition, mordant humor, dealing with a vast sweep of history, and, of course, the slaying of sacred cows. Well, Bill also influenced me professionally in my career as a historian of the British Army in the first half of the 20th century. As a postgrad, I read his book, Britain and Its Army, and was very taken by the force of its arguments, even though in retrospect, they have been revised to some extent by other historians. I also read his book, The Sword Bearers, on high command in the First World War, which was an important early influence on my thinking. But even more important was his attack on the idea that the war poets, Sassoon, Owen, Graves, and the rest, were somehow typical British soldiers of the First World War. With this argument, indeed with many others, Bill was swimming very much against the tide in the 1960s and 70s with his views about the Great War, along, of course, with his friend and ally, John Terraine. Their line was very different from the futility lions led by donkeys approach. Perhaps surprisingly, given his antipathy to Bernard Montgomery, Bill viewed Douglas Haig very favourably. I say surprisingly because Monty and Haig as generals actually had a great deal in common. Well, Bill's work on the BBC Great War TV series was of very great importance indeed. This series was a true landmark, not only in the production of history on television, but also in the way the First World War was viewed. And ironically, although both Bill and John Terraine put forward distinctly revisionist viewpoints in their scripts, it's far from certain that the TV watching public actually noticed. As a historian, Bill always seemed to delight in ruffling feathers. He proved to be a catalyst for vigorous historical debate in at least three areas. Apart from Britain and the First World War, his book, The Desert Generals, which combined a rehabilitation of Auchinleck and other commanders in the pre-Second Alamein Desert War period, with an all-out assault on the man he described as a military messiah, Bernard Law Montgomery. Well, this, again, was another very significant book. Coming at a time when the Monty myth was at its height, it's not surprising that Bill's iconoclasm caused outrage in some circles. Rereading it today, many of Bill's points remain valid, though in some respects he overstated his case. And in recent years, there has been a rebalancing of the historiography of the Desert War, but the idea that First Alamein, fought in July 1942 under Auchinleck, was a pivotal moment, and Montgomery built upon the plans and achievements of his predecessor is now generally accepted by historians. And I think Bill can claim a large share of the credit for shifting forward the historical debate. The third area where Bill gleefully put the cat among the historiographical pigeons is that of the decline of British power. In a series of books and articles from about 1970 onwards, Bill again went against the mainstream by pointing out what he perceived as the failures of the British state and British politicians to deal with the challenges of the post-1945 period. His views can be crudely summarised as the British spent money on the welfare state instead of rebuilding its industries. Well, of course, no work of history, or indeed historian, can be divorced from the times in which that work was written. The 70s and 80s were a period of industrial decline, political strife, in which the apparent certainties of the Attlee Consensus started to unravel. Bill's arguments were seen as very persuasive by some, particularly those on the political right. Well, to be honest, of all Bill's historical writings, these are the ones that have fared least well with the passage of years. But again, he was instrumental in promoting a debate which has enriched our views of British history in the late 20th century. Well, I'll finish by reflecting upon a role which Bill played with great aplomb. One of the hats I wear is that of the president of the Western Front Association. And Bill was my predecessor at one. In fact, he succeeded his great friend John Terraine as president of the WFA. Well, and the WFA, for those who don't know, is an organization which brings together all those interested in the First World War, whether they're academics or lay people. And we have about over 6,000 members and numerous branches, mainly in Britain, but also across the wider world. Well, Bill really enjoyed it. As president, you are not involved in the day-to-day affairs of the association, but rather float above it, being the public face. And Bill was certainly more than a figurehead, quietly offering advice when it is needed, and basically engaging with the wider public. Well, Bill, as one of the best-known historians of the First World War, was a perfect match for this position. And given the fact that he very largely shared the views of his predecessor, John Terraine, on the First World War, it meant there was some continuity. One of the lines said by Donkey's historians have been appointed to the post, things I think would have been very different. Well, Bill and his wife Ruth were regular attenders at WFA events, and because he was very down-to-earth and approachable, went extremely well with the membership and was very popular the rank and file. And the WFA owes him a great deal. So Bill Barnett was a popular historian in the very best sense of the word. He was a prolific writer. I haven't mentioned his book on the Duke of Marlborough or his book on the Royal Navy of the Second World War, among many other books. Bill had the gift of engaging well beyond academia to a broad audience. He wrote clearly, amusingly, and in a style which was often gripping. He could be combative in debate. I crossed swords with him on several occasions over historical interpretations, but he was perfectly charming off duty and certainly didn't hold it against people he argued with. And above all, in three key areas: Britain and the First World War, the Desert War of 1940 to 1943, and the debate about British decline post-1945, Bill made significant contributions to historical debates. That is a sizable legacy as a historian by anyone's standards.
Okay, so now we're going to move from Bill the historian to Bill the inspiring teacher. Now, he didn't teach that often, so we're lucky to have with us Bob Bartlett, and as a young police officer, Bob was a member of Bill's Cambridge Defence Studies group when he was doing a master's degree here. It was obviously very successful because he went on to become a chief superintendent. Bob.
This is when you worry that you picked up the wrong notes. I'm extremely privileged to be asked to represent Bill's students from the early 1980s. My thoughts today are from memory, but I can assure you that memories of Bill have been with me these past 40 years. He was just unforgettable. My role, just as well, is not to comment on Bill's work of a lifetime, but the impact he had on me as a mature student undergraduate from 1980 to 83. The days when life was simpler. Joining the master Bill Hawthorne in the queue for lunch to be told, "About time you passed your exams and left." He was one of the two Bills prominent in my days at Churchill. We hear a great deal about levelling up and making available opportunities for the less fortunate. This is not a new concept for Churchill College. I applied for a place under a Home Office Police Staff College scheme. I was 35, a mature student, married with 2 children, serving as a police inspector. Dr. Roy Foster, who offered me the place, promptly left, leaving me the new Director of Studies, Mark Goldie, to turn me into a student. I was the proud holder of the Army Certificate of Education First Class and had never written an academic essay. Mark worked hard with the late and highly regarded Paul Ginsberg, and I had the task in my first term of seeing if there was anything there to work on, to turn into a student. Paul did at one point say to my wife, the task was near hopeless. However, once the challenge was accepted by those involved, it all ended happily. It was hard, though made easier by meeting Bill Barnett, who took me under his wing. His smiling, mischievous, welcoming and affable nature made him so very accessible, thereby reducing significantly the strains upon this new student. Bill was, I believe, drawn to the positive, can-do, will-do, proactive outlook of the police and military. Through Bill, who seemed very keen to tell me on several occasions he had worked for the North Thames Gas Board, I became familiar with military MPhil students and the Defence Studies Group, which was made up of serving armed forces officers and postgraduate students. They were closer to my age, and we mixed easily. Through Bill, I was welcomed into this group, where I made several friends amongst men who were to become senior in their services. There were presentations by the great and the good, civil servants, ambassadors, generals, admirals, and well-known historians. People on the inside, all from Bill's contact book. Many here today will be used to such opportunities, but for me, used to the rough and tumble of policing on the streets of Surrey and Northamptonshire, it was a revelation. After evening sessions, there were dinners, and on more than one occasion, I joined Bill and his guests for meals in the SCR at Churchill. With Bill, I was exposed to the business of the nation through those who were there, the decision makers. The spring of 1982 was the time of the war in the Falkland Islands, which I and many others followed very closely, all day and every day. During and immediately after the war, there were presentations by key players and journalists, including Max Hastings, then a boots-on-the-ground reporter, who joined us for dinner at Churchill. The most famous speaker of his day was Admiral Lord Lewin, who had the overall responsibility for the operation and for advising Margaret Thatcher. He told us that he had promised the Prime Minister a great deal, then had to deliver. One of Bill's students was Lieutenant Colonel Robin Ross, later to be the General in charge of the Royal Marines, who gave up 45 Commander to come to Cambridge for a year. What a year to be away. His exploits at trying to get down south were extraordinary, including volunteering to parachute onto the battlefield. Robin, in daily contact with the MOD, nagging for a posting, kept us up to speed with what was going on. Exposure to people doing incredible jobs was through Bill's ability to befriend and earn the trust of so many senior people. Bill used to say no one was more than 2 phone calls away. The Defence Studies Group were very strong on jollies. We met in the Senate House, often actually in the Senate, and so I was able to visit parts of the university not usually open to undergraduates. Bill ensured I found the comfortable tea room in the Senate House, normally just for university staff, where tea and toasted tea cakes were the order of the day, eaten in the comfort of large, easy chairs in peaceful surroundings at the heart of the city. A mature student had many illicit opportunities, not open to the fresh-faced, walking on the lawns, cycling on the towpath. Bill organised a top-end jolly with Philip Towell of Queen's, one of my supervisors. I flew with LXX Squadron, affectionately known as Love and Kisses, from the RAF Lynham in Wiltshire. We flew sat behind the pilot on a bench seat in a Hercules at very low level up to Northamptonshire, turned left and followed the M50 into Wales, the observer reading the road signs and looking out for pylons. We were that low. Over Brecon Beacons, where we dropped supplies to the troops on the ground while strapped into the back of the aircraft so not to fall out. Flying back across the Bristol Channel, landing at Lynham. The RAF commanding officer was, of course, one of Bill's former students. Another memorable visit under Bill's leadership was to the Army Eastern District. The visit by the group was considered a prestigious event by the Army, and the red carpet treatment was laid on. We visited a regiment in Colchester for demonstrations and lunch before going to a military training area on the Thetford Heath on the Suffolk-Norfolk border. As we drove in our smart coach onto the training area, on the horizon it was like a scene from Oh, What a Lovely War. On a low hill, on a top of a sand dune, surrounded by sparse conifer trees, were several tables. The tables were covered in snow-white tablecloths. As we debussed and were shown our comfy armchairs, it was obvious that the best mess silver teapots in China had been brought to the training area and carefully set up on the spotless cloths. We sat comfortably in our armchairs, served by immaculately uniformed white-coated soldiers, and drank tea and ate cake, as in these surreal circumstances we watched a mock battle unfold, including the deployment of noisy United States Air Force A-10 tank buster aircraft. We ate our cake very close to the treatment and evacuation of the graphically wounded at an aid station. Being a student with Bill could be very hard. Bill became my special studies supervisor in year 2 of the history tripos, and for the first time gave lectures at the Seeley. Students gathered at 9 a.m. for his first presentation, and in he came with champagne and plastic mugs to celebrate the great event. An American student was nonplussed, but became happier when asked by a former Foreign Office member with crisp aristocratic accent, "Is this not the normal thing to do in the US?" Bill was different. He ran a very good course, but as I recall, he was unhappy with the constraints such activities bring. He had to be in a certain place and time every week, and he found this wearisome. He had to miss one session, and we were played one of his TV programs, possibly the only visual aid I encountered in 3 years. Bill was kind, warm and welcoming, as was his wife Ruth, and an excellent supervisor, putting great energy and endless encouragement into his students' learning. He had the streak of a dissident, a maverick, but ever so politely. A man with a huge contacts book who seemed to be on calling terms with most of the establishment leaders. I have always felt it a privilege to have known Bill. After graduation, for a few years, I remained in contact with Bill. I was chair of the Churchill College Association for several years and would visit college. I recall Bill drove from his house in Norfolk to my home in mid-Surrey to persuade me to work with him on a committee at the college where he sought change. After several frustrating sessions, things did not move forward but went in circles. Bill resigned in frustration and I went with him. He did not live easily with meetings, minutes, matters arising. He was best used as a committee of one, something he taught me. I owe a huge amount to Churchill College, the gamble they took by offering me a place. I remember with great affection Bill Barnett, Mark Goldie, Paul Ginsberg, and my tutor Alan Findlay, 4 men who had considerable influence on my life and that of my family, with our daughter Catherine becoming an undergraduate at Churchill with supervisors Mark and Paul. I did resent, however, the comments from a nameless supervisor who, no matter how true it was, said, "That essay was better than your father's." They broke the mould after Bill. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bob. And now to the Archive Centre, a major part of Bill's life up until his enforced retirement in 1995, and one that was shared by a loyal team. And it's great to see Vic and Leslie and Margaret and Jonathan with us this afternoon. But none were more loyal than his gatekeeper, his organiser, his chief of staff, his PA, his administrator, Josephine Sykes. So much so that after working with Bill, any other keeper of the Archive Centre was always going to be an anticlimax, a situation that Josephine dealt with by leaving, because of course the only alternatives if she'd stayed would have been working for Piers and myself. But Josephine dealt this by leaving and going on to run the office of the Vice-Chancellor of the university. So that's clearly the only way you can follow being the administrator to Bill. Josephine.
Right. So, as Bill would have said, watcher. I remember it very well. It was April 1991, I think. I'd never heard of Correlli Barnett, and my children had grown up, or they got old enough that they were more or less, I could come back to work. But my father had put me in the picture, and I was therefore slightly nervous when I arrived. Bill was there with Paula, who's here tonight, and Margaret, who's here as well, and it was just all so jolly. I wasn't really aware of the fact that it was an interview and suddenly found myself with a job. It was a small and diverse team. Vic, who's here today, had been the conservator for many years, Alan Couchier, who was the Churchill archivist, a lady called Caroline. All that I can remember about her was that her father was the Bishop of Thetford, and she was the archives assistant. Over the next few years, there were a succession of archives assistants, and then the advent of the Thatcher archivist, some of whom are here today, Jonathan. Bill only came in a couple of days a week, and when it was a Bill day, the atmosphere was charged, as we knew that his extraordinary personality would light the place up, and subconsciously we all ratcheted up a notch. 30 years ago, technology was very different. I can remember Alan Kuchera explaining what an email was. I couldn't quite believe it. But Bill was at the cutting edge. He had a little recording machine that he hung around his neck, and as he drove from Norwich, he would record his to-do list so that he could hit the ground running. The trusted recording machine was, however, slightly misleading, as a couple of memorable incidents illustrated. The Archive Centre was purpose-built, and several of the office rooms looked the same. The fax machine lived in the main office, and the shredding machine had the same position in the room used as a common room. Bill was found asking how to dial the number whilst putting the fax through the shredder. Then there was the memorable Mrs. Thatcher visit, which is the story I always tell. Probably everyone's heard it. Bill was very uncharacteristically nervous, and the nerves had managed to transfer themselves to the rest of the team. So by the time she arrived, we were all reduced to jelly. Ever the team leader, though, he brought her straight into the general office to introduce her to us all. This is the main office. And his eyes sort of scanned the room, helplessly looking for something else to say. This is the photocopying machine. And Mrs. Thatcher looked a bit sort of nonplussed, but said, "Oh, is it British?" And, "No," he said, "it's a Mitsubishi." As everyone knows, Bill was extraordinarily lucky on his wonderful relationship with Ruth. Occasionally, when there was a dinner in college, Ruth would come along and sit patiently in the office or pop into Cambridge to do some shopping. He would herald these visits by saying that the matron was coming to drive the ambulance home. One of the highlights of my time at the Archive Centre was when Bill came up with the idea of a Churchill colloquium, which would be held in the newly built Muller Centre. In fact, I can remember Jonathan and I going when they laid the foundation stone of the Muller Centre, which is extraordinary because it now looks quite old, which isn't a good sign. He elicited help from a fascinating historian from All Souls, Oxford, called Alistair something, who really was straight out of central casting. World-famous historians were assembled from both sides of the pond, and it was all executed with military precision. As touched upon by Professor Sheffield, Bill's congenial persona sat alongside a bit of a contentious streak. He got into a terrible spat with a fellow historian. Letters were sent backwards and forwards and got increasingly snarky. Bill's final broadside was a letter which simply said, "Dear Armand, you are a nut." And Alan has asked me specially to clarify that this was not Mark Armand of Soft Cell, which I have to say rather shows that your children are younger than mine. I've worked with several very charismatic people, but Bill is the only one to mention me in the acknowledgements of one of his books. And this was going to be my final denouement because it's the very book that was introduced by Lord Danett. And so that was going to be my punchline, but you ruined it by saying that Lord Danett did the foreword on leadership in war. But basically, it was a book about good leaders, and that is poignant because Bill was similarly a great leader, albeit of our little team.
Josephine, thank you so much. And now we come to the future and to the family. Dr. Olivia Barnett Nagshini is an economic anthropologist whose work explores alternatives to capitalism, critiques of colonialization, and offers decolonized feminist futures. She's currently writing her first book based on research in a food market in the highlands of Papua New Guinea titled Indigenous Economies of Care. She outlines the emotional and gendered dimensions to an economy based on reciprocity and how cash crops, money, and the marketplace play into local ideas of morality. She's currently based in Denmark as a postdoctoral fellow, working on a project called heart openings, the cultivation and experience of love, and she'll return to Papua New Guinea for further field work in the spring of 2023. She's flown in specially for this event from Denmark today to pay her own personal and professional tribute. And the reason I dwelt on her own studies is because on first hearing, her own path may sound very different to her grandfather's. And in many ways, of course, it is. But as you're about to hear, it shares common roots and owes much to his mentoring. Olivia.
Hi, I'm going to try and do this without crying, but I've practiced a couple of times without crying, so hopefully it'll be okay. So, in the words of my grandfather, Struth, how tremendous that you are all here. He would have been so chuffed and flattered. So on behalf of him and our family, thank you all for taking the time to be here. Sorry, I won't cry through the whole thing, I promise. And of course, thank you to Churchill Archive Centre and especially Alan for your efforts in organising this event and your generous hospitality in hosting us. And thank you also for inviting me to speak. It feels really special and is an honour and a privilege, especially to be on such an esteemed and lovely panel. So it's been hard to find the words to share today because I was very close with Bill throughout my life. Sorry, but especially the last 2 years since his wife Ruth. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to. I will get through it. Whew, okay. Especially the last 2 years since his wife Ruth, our grandmother Nana, passed away in March 2020, just before the national lockdown. Albeit a sad and hard time for our family and the world, I was quite lucky in that my work was forced online and I was able to begin a new research position based in Cornwall in Jamaica from my laptop in East Carlton, Ruth and Bill's village, often sitting alongside Bill in his library. The summer of 2020 became one of the best summers I can remember. Sorry. Bill was continuously keeping those of us in his bubble entertained with stories of how he had designed his beloved garden, of where him and Ruth had acquired various parts of their carefully designed and decorated house, Fort Capridge, and we shared many meals together, otherwise known as his rations. Up to the very end, Bill was upbeat, kind, and very grateful for all of the care he was receiving, and I was grateful to have so much time with him. Through the ups and downs of 2020 and 2021, and many years before that, Bill pulled me through, as he did for other members of the family at various times in their lives too. But whilst we had great banter and mutual respect, we also had intense disagreements, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we saw the world quite differently at times. However, Bill was committed to the fact that I should think for myself and develop my own critical abilities. Alongside debate and discussion, we always enjoyed sharing and laughs and at mostly his inappropriate jokes, as well as evaluating moral and emotional dilemmas. But it was always a mystery to me how we could get on so well and yet disagree so much on social and political matters. I've come to realize that this capacity for love and respect at the same time as disagreement is perhaps one of Bill's most important qualities. For instance, a few weeks before he died, my neighbour told me that she had read an article about early declinist thinkers mentioning Bill. I found the article in The Economist from 2021, and thanks to Google, ended up on the London Review of Books website reading an exchange from 1996 between Bill and David Edgerton about Bill's book, The Lost Victory. As I was sat on Bill's terrace, across the table from him, I read the tone he used to defend his ideas, and I was a little shocked. I couldn't believe the direct nature of their exchange and the sassiness of Bill's writing. Not long after, we were again enjoying his beloved sun trap on the terrace when the postman arrived to deliver his first 95th birthday card. Bill opened it, inspected it, looked inside, saying something along the lines of, "How jolly nice." I looked over his shoulder and read it aloud, impressed to see that it was written by the very same David Edgerton. He wrote saying he had heard at the Roskill lecture that Bill was turning 95 and wanted to wish him a happy birthday. I asked Billy who he was. A distinguished historian, he said. The content of what they were debating had not stayed with me, but when this card arrived, it struck me that whatever academic disputes they'd had, there was evidently a mutual respect. Since Bill has passed, I've realised I wasn't the only lefty that he enjoyed getting into heated debates with. The day after he died, I spoke to a close friend of his and my grandmother's named Jude, wife of Bill's long and close friend Paul Brown, a radical, long-bearded potter who died when I was too young to really know him. Bill and Paul met in Palestine when they were called up for national service in 1946. They had very opposing views, but loved to engage in deep political and philosophical debate. As Jude told me that day, their relationship was really based on disagreement. When we were going through Bill's personal archives in preparation for a visit from the Churchill Archive Centre, I found the file of letters that Bill had kept between him and Paul. Jude had told me of their extensive letters to each other, but I was tickled to find out how much effort they went to, creating sarcastic caricatures of each other whilst ripping apart one another's arguments and debating whether they were having the same argument at all. Some of these exchanges included whether the increased import of foods from elsewhere should be a worry for Britain and the benefits of domestic organic agriculture. Paul referenced the import of French apples, which he renamed Golden Disgustings, to which Bill responded with remarks on the gnarly, warty apples of old decrepit orchards in England. Their debate continued into the details of soil systems, with Bill pointing out the pong he would smell on the drive down to Cambridge. I assume in reference to the already organic aspects of Britain's agriculture. In one such letter to his dear friend, rather than Paul, Bill addressed it to Mr. Heap. Not Mr. Uriah Heap, but instead manure or urea. Reading these letters had me laughing through tears as I suddenly met these now deceased old blokes in full flow writing 30 years ago. Even though I was on Paul's side and against intensive food production, I was impressed by how outrageous Bill could be with his provocative and playful wit. I was also impressed by how artfully Paul responded, evidently an equal match, with ounces of sarcasm, but always signing off with tender and humble words of love. Bill would never let himself be labelled right or left wing, and he said he took every matter on its own terms, examining the facts case by case. As a social scientist, I found this hard to believe. Such a seemingly neutral position, is it even possible? And we would debate this. But unbothered by the Marxist or otherwise critical theory I engaged with for my own work, Bill read my undergraduate and postgraduate essays with a keen eye and did everything he could to help me sharpen and hone my arguments. And I know he did for other grandchildren too, including my brother Alex. He never sought to impose his way of thinking upon us and only wanted to encourage our own critical minds. When I moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2013 to begin my PhD, Bill printed off a piece of paper and gave it to me before our goodbye. At the time, I did not really understand the significance of these words. Nonetheless, this piece of paper has always been pinned in front of my desk. In his characteristically playful manner, he titled them CB's Standing Orders, so I'll share some of them with you now. 1. Never allow yourself to fall under the dominance of A, any other person, B, any ideology or set of beliefs. Instead, always remain skeptical and critical, especially in regard to received or fashionable ideas. In other words, at all costs, preserve your own intellectual independence. I think these words and the practical advice that followed them are testimony to how thoughtful and wise Billy truly was. I'm still learning to have greater confidence in what I have to say, but whatever skills I have, I owe much of them to Bill. For example, when it came to public speaking, Bill taught me how to write out my script in advance, practice in the mirror, and time myself to ensure I would always come in on time. He taught me to write extras in the margins, where to pause, where to breathe, where to allow time for a little reflection, and suggested I add a few humorous bits at the last minute that could sound off the cuff. Another reason I'm grateful for Bill's mentorship is that what I have learnt about mentorship itself. Since supervising postgraduate students, I've realised the importance of offering emotional and moral support as well as intellectual feedback. He also always approved when I said that I'd taken my students to the pub. It's obviously something you guys enjoyed doing together. It was lovely that in June this year, I was even able to do a couple of supervisions with Bill alongside. During one Zoom meeting, I was advising a student who was planning to interview her own grandfather on his experience of being exiled from Egypt to France in the mid-20th century. They had had a breakdown in their relationship because of political differences. I advised her to assure her grandfather that she wanted to listen to his perspective and try to understand it so that perhaps they could find each other again through deep listening. Sitting next to me, Bill agreed and said, "That's jolly good advice," before quietly nodding off to sleep. I miss Bill dearly and always dreaded the day that he would no longer be around for me to talk to. So to honour Bill, my final words are his, KBO.
Okay, well, I think you'll agree we've had 6 fantastic presentations, combining analysis, seriousness, frankness, humour, warmth, and, as we've just seen, emotion. So 6 very different presentations, 6 very different aspects of Bill. But of course, as we're all aware, that is only part of the story. And everyone here has had their own interactions with Bill, and will have their own stories and anecdotes. So this is the part of the presentation where we turn it open to the floor, and we encourage you to share your memories of Bill. Now, I should say, of course, first of all, that we are recording this afternoon's proceedings, and that we do intend to put this up on the college YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear on YouTube for any reason, then probably best not to make a comment. But I hope that doesn't deter too many of you. If you would like to say something, please raise your hand. You then have 2 options. You can remain seated, and Catherine or Amanda will bring the roving microphone to you. Or if you would like, you can make your way up to the podium here and address the audience from the stage. So we're turning it open now. Who would like to go first? Well, seems only right to give the first word here to Bill's successor, Piers Brendan, who followed him as keeper of the Archive Centre in 1995. Piers.
Thank you, Alan. I'll come up here. Practically everything that I plan to say has already been said, particularly the joke about Mark Almond from Josephine. But I have got various things to say. What a wonderful tribute from Olivia. And I really want to sort of follow a little bit on that. Because Bill was a combative person. He was cogent, he was pungent. And as A.J.P. Taylor said about his book, The Collapse of British Power, it was fine fighting stuff. Bill was affable, he was amusing, he was almost boyish in his lightheartedness, but he was combative all the time, pugnacious. He was a militant as well as a military historian. Indeed, as I said at the dinner celebrating his 80th birthday, Bill reminded me of what Punch said about Lord Palmerston. He never sleeps, though he sometimes rests his head on a loaded cannon. He also reminded me of Dr. Johnson, of whom Goldsmith said that if his pistol misfired, he would knock you down with the butt. And it must be said that, in all candor, that I myself experienced the butt of Bill's pistol on several occasions. He was, as the Times said, a late period angry young man, and his books were pugnacious too, but they were always well researched, has been said. They were very controversial for those of us who are on the left. And let me give you one example of this. In The Lost Victory in 1995, Bill condemned post-war expenditure on the welfare state for creating a dependency culture, and ridiculed the Labour Party's dream of a new Jerusalem, which turned into the dank reality of a segregated, subliterate, unskilled, unhealthy, and institutionalized proletariat hanging on the nipple of state materialism. Typical Bill remark. Of course, this was music to the ears of the right, but as Bill intended, it was gall and wormwood to the left. And David Kynaston retorted rather sharply that there were many free lunches between 1945 and 1979, but it was not society's losers who ate most of them, let alone the best of them. I'm sure that I'm sure that nothing is more important really in this context than Bill's 17 years as keeper of the Churchill Archive Centre. And I don't want to duplicate remarks about that, but I'd simply say that the difficulties that Bill faced were immense. Lack of resources, the insecurity of the Churchill papers being the most serious of them. And he triumphed over this, and in the process added hugely to the collections. The first thing that he taught me to do when I arrived as his successor, knowing absolutely nothing about archives at all, was that, except how to use them, I did know that, is the skill of writing hearse letters. And hearse letters were a staple mechanism that Bill used to raise future contributions in the form of papers to the Archive Centre, so that we kept our eyes open, eagle eyes open for the obituaries. And if there was any likely person, we'd write to the grieving widow and say that it would be a good idea for his papers or her papers to come into the Archive Centre. And by that means, many collections were raised. He also raised pots of money, started the Roskilde Lecture, which I think has been mentioned, and of course negotiated for the Churchill the security of the Churchill papers and did much to get the Thatcher papers. When Bill hailed the outstanding success of the first full-time professional director of the Archive Centre at the governing body, I remember saying at that august body that I always felt uneasy when agreeing with Bill about anything. But on this matter, I entirely shared his view. And I would add, and I'm sure Alan would concur, that his spectacular achievements rest on the foundations laid by Bill. If Bill hadn't established a rapport with the Iron Lady, assisted by the fact that he is, or he was, what she famously called one of us, and what lefties would call one of them, we would probably not have acquired the Thatcher papers, and with them the huge sum of money that enabled us to raise to be raised for the transformation of the Archive Centre. So the college owes Bill a permanent debt of gratitude, and it will feel the loss of his charming and stimulating and pugnacious presence. But perhaps we should cling to the thought that he may now be raising merry hell in heaven.
Okay, well, you've made it very embarrassing for me to try and follow that, Piers. But I mean, I think the truth is, and I think most people in the hall here know, that the Churchill Archive Centre possibly wouldn't exist at all, and certainly wouldn't exist in the form that it is in now, without the huge contribution that Bill and his team made in steering it through those crucial early years. And many of the things that we do now are collecting policy, the Roskilde Lecture, which happens every 2 years, our active outreach program, our program of archives by fellowships around, all of these are things, are programs that started with Bill and with his team. So it's certainly true that we owe an enormous debt, and this afternoon is just one very small first step in trying to repay that. So do come afterwards and eat as much cake and drink as much drink as you can, and do come upstairs and view the Archive Centre. Okay, do we have further contributions? So gentleman just over here, do you want to come up, or do you want... Yeah. And if you can introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher Dorman O'Gowan. I am the son of Major General Eric Dorman Smith, MC, deceased, who was, for those of you who have read The Desert Generals and similar books, Chief of Staff to General Sir Claude Auchinleck at the First Battle of Alamein. My father was Deputy Chief of the General Staff Middle East, and on the 25th of June, 1942, Auchinleck and he went up to Alamein to take over from General Ritchie, who had succeeded in leading the Eighth Army to its one and only defeat at the Battle of Gazala. The reason I know Bill is I first met him when I was about 14 and witnessed him bounding up the steps of our family home in Ireland, a young man as he then was, and I was even very considerably younger, but I do remember him vividly. And it was only in later years, after I'd completed my commission and was indulging in other activities of a legal nature, did I get in touch with him again. And we carried on a correspondence. I got to know Ruth. On occasions, I went to stay at his house at Catbridge. There is one theme which has come through, certainly the first 3 or 4 speakers, with regard to Bill and the book, The Desert Generals, which exploded on the world of history at about 1960, was the painstaking research in which he had indulged. And that is why his works, and that of Britain and her army and allied books published over the years, have stood the test of time. And in terms of history, the test of time is the acid test. If you haven't done your groundwork, your spade work, and so on, you will eventually be found out. Bill has not been found out, either in Desert Generals or in other books. And to him, and that is why I'm standing here now, and to him I am eternally grateful for what he did to rehabilitate both Auchinleck and A Fortiori, my father, who was with Auchinleck throughout those times. He gave the lie to the big lie. And the big lie was that all was going to hell in a handcart beforehand. Somebody, as a prime minister, arrived, changed everything, Montgomery took over, and all was wonderful. That was the big lie. And Bill put that right. And this is a common theme, and it was mentioned by Lord Dannatt and Sir Max Hastings and Gary Sheffield as well, that Bill Barnett changed everything. And he put the bomb under World War II history, and it has stood the test of time. And I am eternally grateful to him for that, and to his family, and to Ruth, and of course his descendants. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And of course, we're grateful to you and your father for the fact that that correspondence between Bill and your father is now here in the Archive Centre. And actually, some of that is going to be up on display for you to see this afternoon. Okay, looking for further contributions. Archie, do you want to come up? Or okay, Kevin.
I speak with some hesitation.
Yeah, yes, it's on.
I speak with a little hesitation. Being a mere physicist, I have no qualifications to comment on the heavyweight history stuff. I came into contact with Bill most closely when, as president of the senior common room in the college, I had to organize the 80th birthday party for him, which was a daunting experience. I discovered rapidly that he had possibly the record-breaking shelf length of bookshelves in this college library. This could be checked. This was a lot of stuff to follow up on. The main things I remember from that event were first of all, there's an anecdote which has not been mentioned about dueling. There was a governing body meeting in the college which had taken place maybe 10 years before then, where an exceptionally heated argument blew up between our bursar of the time and the director of studies in law. And it really was quite exceptional. And Bill suddenly intervened and offered to lend the two of them his dueling pistols. He had a case of these. And he further gave the impression that these dueling pistols were more or less immediately to hand in his office, and we could conduct the business right away. This had a remarkably cooling effect on the argument. The other thing I regret now is most of our interchanges with Bill about this event were conducted by email, so I can't treasure in my collection one of these letters which he used to write dated with the date like Austerlitz Day or something of that kind. So some of these things are mentioned in the poem. I discovered one of the things I learned as president of this common room was that it was a lot easier to make something that rhymed than make a speech. You can get away with murder if it rhymes. And so here's an update of I did one when he was 90. This is an improved version of that. Bill Barnett in memoriam. The fighting of the human race ensures some former battle marks each dawning day. In dear Bill's diary, the list endures, shows how for him the past imposed its sway. Through his broad vision, charted our decline. Battle of Britain Day, Bill chose to die. To swim against the tide he'd often incline, still celebrates that triumph in the sky. The wellspring of technology Bill brought, a novel draft of history imbibed. Our loss of empire galvanized his thought, collapse of power and industry described. In auditing the course of each event, Bill countless errors ruthlessly exposed. The many officers whose lives were spent, their name and college from dog tags disclosed. He'd love our Churchill-Empire race debate. Engage more closely with no punches pulled, he might advise. Let dueling operate, but trenchant views with rock-hard facts he fueled. Thank you.
Archie, thank you very much. I have to say that the dueling pistols are no longer in the office of the director or keeper, which seems a great shame. Having said that, there is a cannonball which now sits underneath the interior archive centre staircase, which I suspect has some connection with Bill. If the dueling pistols turn up, we would love to have them as part of the collection here. Okay, we're looking for further contributions. So, Adrian.
Thank you. Adrian Crisp, I'm past chair of the Churchill Archives Committee. As a new medical fellow at Churchill in 1993, with a lifelong interest in history, I soon met Bill. He directed me towards the papers of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, the naval architect of Dunkirk, North Africa, Sicily, and D-Day, and I spent many happy hours reading them in the archives. And Ramsay became a chronic addiction, as Alan will affirm, that I do not stop talking about him. Bill and I also shared another interest. We were both members of an almost extinct cult in Churchill College. We were both pragmatic conservatives. I have never forgotten Bill's loud exclamation across a full Jock Colville Hall one day, clearly targeted at me. "Damned traitor!" I looked confused. "You're wearing that horrible yellow tie," the same one I'm wearing today in Bill's honor. "You must have defected to the Liberal Democrats." I was able to reassure him that I was no quisling. Thank you.
Adrian, thank you. Okay, further contributions from the floor. Okay, Mark. Do you want to come to the podium? Yeah, okay.
Mark Goldie, one of the historians of the college, which Bill was very kind to mention. It's certainly, as you pointed out, a striking fact that in 1980 you had between you a Marxist historian teaching you and a conservative historian, with me somewhere in the middle. I don't want to make a personal recollection, though. I just thought it worthwhile putting in a quick word for Bill's very first book, which, in passing, you mentioned and is on display upstairs, because his very first book was a novel published in 1957. And it's worth looking at just for the dust jacket alone, if only for the photograph of him in the dust jacket, and for the blurb produced by an obviously over-eager, if I may say so, over-eager publisher, who announced that this was obviously one of the new angry young men of the 1950s, and that he will make, said the dust jacket, a gay addition to the young men of the 50s, like Kingsley Amis, John Osborne, and Colin Wilson. Then over-egging the cake even more, the blurb carried on, this man Barnett was a satirist of evil and warlike propensity. Well, the novel's anti-hero is a vapid charmer called Anthony Marland, who scraped a degree in English literature and had got his oar at Oxford University, but was now completely at sea as an industrial trainee in a big commercial organization called the Hump Organization, which is the title of the book. Now, the Hump Organization is a sclerotic behemoth of British industry. It makes cars and tin cans. At the top of the organization is an ignorant and incompetent boss called Sir Poundley Hump. And down below where Anthony is a set of pipsqueak Jobsworths. Anthony, bored from the beginning, distracts himself first by deflowering a secretary called Bettina, and then by seducing Sir Poundley's wife, Lady Hump. This turns out to be extremely useful because Lady Hump rewards her paramour by having him appointed personal assistant to Sir Poundley himself. Then Anthony and his much brighter and savvy American Rhodes Scholar friend from Oxford managed to catch Sir Poundley in a very compromising situation, which I daren't in this audience describe, and use this knowledge of Sir Poundley to blackmail him into doing the one useful thing in Sir Poundley's life, creating the first professorship of business administration in a university at Oxford. The newspapers love it and announce that into industry at last will flow an ever-increasing stream of first-class young men imbued with scientific knowledge of managerial techniques. Needless to say, the Oxford dons loathe the whole idea and would rather the endowment had gone on some deeply obscure discipline. Well, this novel is a very light romp and shouldn't be taken as a manifesto for his future thoughts, the author's future thoughts. But nonetheless, if you read it knowing what Bill will say in his future novels, it's all there laid out. His contempt for the follies and failures of British industry, but equally his contempt for left-wing nostrums that are bleated by his first girlfriend, Bettina, in the book, and his general despair at the condition of England in the 1950s. Indeed, one could almost call this in comparison with those 19th century novels of the 1840s, a condition of England novel. And if one reads between the lines, one can see all the thoughts that would go into his very important theme of British declinism, which we've heard mention of. Great military historian, but immensely important, particularly for the Thatcher administration, who, and it's not been pointed out, Thatcher and her colleagues advised cabinet ministers to read Correlli Barnett, not his books on war, but his books on the decline or alleged decline of British industry and its failures, the failures of British leadership since 1945. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. The novel sounds like the ideal preparation for dealing with the sex and politics of a Cambridge college. On that note, we will adjourn round the corner to the Archive Centre, to the Jock Colville Hall, where refreshments should be awaiting us. As I say, there is a display at the top of the stairs. All we ask is that you don't take your drink up with you when you go and visit the archives. So it is true, as we heard from Archie earlier on, that Bill used to date his letters by the anniversaries of military events, normally battles. So my parting fact for you today is that we're on the anniversary of the naval action of the 24th of October 1798, which was a minor naval engagement of the French Revolutionary Wars, fought between a British Royal Navy frigate and 2 ships of the Batavian Navy. Not many people would have known that. One suspects that Bill would, and that he would also have known that it was a British victory, which seems appropriate. Thank you all very much.